There is a mountain in the state of Pennsylvania that does not look like much from the outside. You drive past it on a two-lane road. You see trees, you see rock, you see a hillside that looks exactly like every other hillside in that part of the country. But underneath that mountain, carved directly into the granite, is one of the most sophisticated military installations ever constructed by human beings. A facility designed not to fight a war, but to survive one. To survive the end of the world as we know it, and keep the United States government functioning on the other side. Most Americans have never heard of it. Most Americans will never see it. And yet every single day, that place exists, staffed, powered, and ready for the moment that everyone hopes will never come. Today we are going inside that facility, and others like it. We are going inside the world of continuity of government, the secret infrastructure built to ensure that if nuclear fire ever does fall on American soil, someone with authority will survive to respond. If that sounds like something out of a movie, understand this. It is completely real. It has been real for 70 years. And the full story of how it was built, what it contains, who lives and works inside it, and what it was actually designed to do, will change the way you look at the mountains, the roads, and the ordinary landscape of this country forever. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Over 98% of people watch without subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. Now let us get into it. To understand why these facilities exist, you have to go back to a specific moment in American history, a moment when the entire premise of national security changed overnight. The date is August 29, 1949. The Soviet Union detonates its first nuclear weapon at a test site in Kazakhstan. American intelligence picks up the signal. Scientists confirm what they feared. The United States no longer has a monopoly on the most destructive weapon ever created. And within a matter of years, the Soviets would have hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the ability to strike the American mainland with weapons capable of erasing entire cities in seconds. The men in Washington who understood what that meant did not sleep well, because they knew something the public did not fully grasp. A nuclear strike would not just kill people, it would kill governments. It would kill command structures. It would kill the people with their fingers on the buttons, the people who held the legal authority to respond, the people whose survival was not just personally important but strategically essential. If a first strike could decapitate the American government, the military, the entire chain of command, what would be left to respond? What would prevent a follow-on attack? What would prevent total collapse? These were not abstract questions. They were the most urgent military and political problems of the 20th century. And the answer that emerged from years of planning, study, debate, and classified engineering was this. You build places where the government can survive, not just survive physically, but survive functionally. Places with communications, with command authority, with power, with food, with water, with everything required to keep the government of the United States breathing and operational after a nuclear exchange. These are the doomsday bunkers. And they are far more sophisticated, far more numerous, and far more deeply integrated into the fabric of American infrastructure than almost anyone realizes. The most famous of these facilities, the one that has been partially declassified and partially open to public tours, is the Raven Rock Mountain Complex. It sits on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border near Blue Ridge Summit, carved into the granite of the Appalachian Mountains. Its official designation is Site R. Its unofficial nickname among those who work there, and those who study these things, is the Underground Pentagon. And when you understand what is inside it, that nickname makes complete sense. Raven Rock is not a bunker in the traditional sense. It is not a hole in the ground with some concrete walls and a generator. It is a fully functional underground city. The facility spans roughly 350,000 square feet. That is the equivalent of a significant office complex. It contains multiple freestanding buildings inside the mountain, actual buildings with multiple floors, not just rooms carved out of rock, but constructed structures with steel frames, built inside caverns that were blasted out of the granite. Those buildings sit on massive springs, enormous shock absorbers designed to cushion the facility against the physical shock wave of a nuclear detonation nearby. Because the engineers who designed Raven Rock understood that a close nuclear strike would not just send radiation, it would send a physical wave of pressure through the ground, through the rock, through the mountain itself. And anything not mounted on isolation systems would be shaken apart. So they built the whole thing to ride out that shock wave, the way a ship rides out a wave at sea. The facility has its own power generation capability. It has its own water supply drawn from underground sources. It has its own food storage and preparation facilities capable of sustaining a significant population for an extended period without any outside resupply. It has its own communication systems, hardened against electromagnetic pulse, the burst of energy that a nuclear detonation sends out, and that can destroy unprotected electronics across enormous distances. Raven Rock is connected to the Pentagon by a series of communication lines and has the ability to function as the alternate command center for the entire Department of Defense. If the Pentagon were destroyed, Raven Rock could theoretically absorb its command functions and keep the military operational. The people who staff it, the military officers and civilian personnel who rotate through assignment there, have trained for the transition. They have plans. They have protocols. And those plans are not gathering dust. They are actively maintained, actively exercised, and actively updated to reflect current threats. During the Cold War, Raven Rock was in many ways the backstop of American military authority. The facility was built beginning in the early 1950s and has been continuously upgraded and expanded ever since. The specifics of its current capabilities are classified, but what has been confirmed through declassified documents, congressional testimony, and the accounts of people who served there paints a picture of a facility that is genuinely extraordinary by any standard. And Raven Rock is only one piece of the puzzle. There is another facility that in some ways is even more famous, even more remarkable, and whose story involves a level of secrecy that was maintained for nearly 30 years before it finally unraveled. That facility is the Greenbrier. And its story is one of the most astonishing in the entire history of American government. The Greenbrier is a luxury resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. It has been operating since the 18th century. American presidents have stayed there. European royalty has stayed there. It is the kind of place with chandeliers and formal dining and grounds that look like something out of a magazine, and underneath it for nearly 3 decades, the United States government maintained a fully operational emergency relocation facility for the United States Congress. The entire Congress. All of the House of Representatives and all of the Senate. Enough space for every member of the legislative branch of the United States government to relocate in the event of nuclear war and continue functioning as a legal governing body. The code name for the facility was Project Greek Island. Construction began in 1958 under the cover of a renovation and expansion of the resort itself. Workers who participated in the construction signed non-disclosure agreements. The facility was built beneath a new wing of the hotel, called the West Virginia Wing, and it was hidden in plain sight inside one of the most visible, most visited resort destinations on the East Coast. The underground facility contained sleeping quarters for every member of Congress. Not lavish quarters, but functional ones, designed to house people for weeks or months if necessary. It contained a large meeting chamber for the House and a separate chamber for the Senate, both built underground, both equipped with the communications and support systems needed for a functioning legislature. It had a medical facility, a dining facility, power generation, decontamination showers for people arriving after a nuclear event, and a communications center with the capability to broadcast to the American public on behalf of the government. The idea was chilling in its logic. If Washington were destroyed, if the Capitol were vaporized, if most of the city were gone, the members of Congress who had been evacuated to the Greenbrier could reconstitute the legislative branch of the United States government and, at least in theory, maintain constitutional continuity. The managers of the facility maintained a cover story for decades. The above-ground space they used for routine activities was presented as a television studio used by the resort for corporate events. The bunker below was presented as nothing at all. Maintenance staff who worked in the facility were told they were working for a company called Forsyth Associates, which was actually a government front organization managing the facility on behalf of the government. Security was extraordinary. Access was controlled, and the secret held, remarkably, for nearly 3 decades. It was finally broken in 1992, when the Washington Post published a detailed investigative report exposing the facility. The government acknowledged what had been built, and once the secret was out, the facility was decommissioned as an active emergency relocation site, because the whole premise of a secret bunker depends on the enemy not knowing where you plan to hide. With the location published in a major national newspaper, the strategic value was gone. Today, the Greenbrier bunker is open for tours. You can walk through the meeting chambers, you can see the dormitories, you can stand in the decontamination corridor and try to imagine what it would have felt like to arrive there in the hours after a nuclear exchange. It is one of the most sobering walks you can take in America, because standing there looking at the rows of simple bunks where senators and congressmen were expected to sleep while their constituents died on the surface above, the full weight of what the Cold War really meant becomes completely real. But the Greenbrier and Raven Rock, as dramatic as they are, represent only a fraction of the system that was built. Because the planners who thought through continuity of government in the 1950s and 1960s understood something important. A government that can only survive if it gets to one specific place is fragile. You need redundancy. You need multiple locations. You need the ability to operate from anywhere, to move, to disperse authority, so that no single strike can eliminate the entire chain of command. That thinking produced a network of facilities that extended far beyond the East Coast, far beyond the mountains of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and far beyond what most Americans have ever imagined. The Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center is one of the most significant of these. Located in Virginia, near the town of Bluemont, carved into the Blue Ridge Mountains, Mount Weather is the primary emergency operations center for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But its history and its purpose go far deeper than disaster management. Mount Weather was developed in the 1950s as a relocation site for senior executive branch officials, members of the cabinet, the Supreme Court, and other essential government personnel in the event of nuclear war. It contains essentially the same categories of infrastructure as the other facilities: power generation, communications, housing, medical capability, food storage. But Mount Weather has one additional function that makes it particularly significant. It serves as the location from which a shadow government, a reconstituted executive branch with the authority to manage national affairs, would operate in the aftermath of a catastrophic attack. The concept of a shadow government is one that sounds like conspiracy theory until you look at the actual legislation, the actual executive orders, and the actual government programs that gave it shape and authority. The concept of continuity of government, often abbreviated COG, has been the subject of presidential directives going back to Eisenhower. It has been formalized through a series of executive orders that assign specific individuals to specific roles in a post-attack governmental structure. These are not hypothetical positions. They are real designations, with real people assigned to them on a rotating basis, with real training programs to prepare those people for the roles they might have to fill. The program even has a specific designation system called the Designated Survivor Protocol, where at major events like the State of the Union address, one senior cabinet official is deliberately kept away from the event and positioned in a secure location. This ensures that if the Capitol building were destroyed during the address, killing the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the cabinet members, the Supreme Court justices, and essentially the entire leadership of the American government simultaneously, there would still be someone with constitutional authority left to serve as president. That person is the designated survivor. It is a real protocol. It happens every year. And the fact that it happens every year, quietly, routinely, is itself a measure of how seriously the government has always taken the possibility of catastrophic decapitation. The engineering that went into these facilities is worth spending some real time on, because it represents one of the most sophisticated applications of structural and mechanical engineering ever undertaken. Consider the problem the engineers faced in the 1950s. They needed to build structures that could survive not a direct hit from a nuclear weapon, which was considered essentially impossible regardless of construction, but the near-miss scenario. A weapon detonated close enough to produce tremendous ground shock, overpressure, and radiation, but not directly above the facility. They needed structures that could absorb and isolate those forces. The solution involved several overlapping engineering strategies. The first was depth. By placing facilities deep inside mountains, the engineers used the mountain itself as shielding. Granite is an extraordinarily effective absorber of nuclear radiation, and enough rock between a facility and the surface can dramatically reduce the radiation exposure inside. Raven Rock has enough granite overhead to provide substantial protection against all but a very close detonation. The second strategy was isolation. The buildings inside these mountain facilities are not attached to the walls of the cavern. They sit on spring systems, on massive isolators made of steel and rubber and compressed air that allow the building to move independently of the surrounding rock. When a shock wave passes through the mountain, the rock moves, and the buildings inside, cushioned by those springs, move less. The human beings inside experience something rough and terrifying, but potentially survivable, rather than the instant destruction they would experience if the buildings were rigidly attached to the rock. The third strategy was self-sufficiency. Every major facility was engineered to function as a closed system for an extended period. The calculations about how long these facilities needed to be self-sufficient evolved over time as nuclear weapons got more powerful and delivery systems got more accurate. In the early Cold War, planners might have thought in terms of days or weeks of isolation. By the height of the Cold War, they were thinking in terms of months: food storage, water purification, air filtration, power generation, medical supply. All of it had to be sized and designed for extended, independent operation. The air filtration systems deserve particular attention. One of the effects of a nuclear detonation that many people do not fully appreciate is the contamination of the air with radioactive particles. Nuclear fallout, the cloud of radioactive debris that a surface or near-surface detonation sends into the atmosphere, can drift hundreds of miles on the wind and contaminate vast areas. The air filtration systems in these facilities were designed to remove particulate contamination from outside air before it entered the living and working spaces. They used multiple stages of filtration, including HEPA-grade filters and activated charcoal, along with positive pressure systems that kept the interior of the facility at a slightly higher air pressure than the outside, preventing unfiltered air from seeping through any cracks or seams. The power generation systems used diesel generators as the primary backup, with fuel stored in quantities sufficient for extended operation. The water systems drew from underground aquifers and included treatment and purification capability. The communication systems used hardened cables, hardened radio equipment, and antenna systems designed to survive the electromagnetic pulse effects of nuclear detonations. Now, electromagnetic pulse deserves its own discussion because it represents one of the most technically sophisticated challenges in the entire domain of nuclear survivability planning. When a nuclear weapon detonates, particularly at high altitude, it generates an intense burst of electromagnetic energy. This energy interacts with the Earth's magnetic field and with anything on the surface that can conduct electricity. The result is a massive surge in electrical systems, a surge so powerful that it can destroy transistors, circuit boards, computer systems, communication equipment, and essentially any modern electronics across an enormous area. A single high-altitude nuclear detonation over the center of the United States could theoretically damage or destroy the electrical grid across the entire country, disable communication systems, and render modern vehicles, aircraft, and military equipment inoperable across vast distances. This effect was first observed during early atmospheric nuclear tests in the Pacific in the 1950s and 1960s, when test detonations produced unexpected damage to electrical equipment at substantial distances. The military and government planners who studied those results understood immediately that any continuity of government facility that relied on modern electronics would be vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse, unless those electronics were specifically protected. The protection method is called a Faraday cage, after the 19th century physicist Michael Faraday, who first described the principle. A Faraday cage is a continuous metal enclosure that surrounds electromagnetic fields from penetrating it. The concept is simple, but implementing it across an entire underground facility is a significant engineering challenge. Every cable entering or leaving the protected space must pass through a filter. Every ventilation opening must be designed in a way that blocks electromagnetic penetration. Every door must seal electrically. The entire facility must function as one enormous electromagnetic shield, while also functioning as a livable, workable human environment. The engineers who built and upgraded these facilities spent decades refining the technology and the construction methods to achieve that combination. And as electronics evolved from the relatively simple vacuum tubes of the 1950s to the extraordinarily complex microprocessor-based systems of the modern era, the challenge of EMP protection became simultaneously more important and more technically demanding. Let us talk about the people, because these facilities are not empty shells. They are staffed. They have been staffed continuously since they were built. The men and women who work in and around these facilities are some of the most carefully selected and thoroughly trained government and military personnel anywhere in the system. Consider what their role actually entails. They are the people who would be responsible for the transition, for taking a government that suddenly no longer has its normal infrastructure, its normal locations, its normal communications, and keeping it functional. They have to know who has authority when certain officials are dead or unreachable. They have to know how to operate communication systems that may be the only link between the surviving government and the surviving military. They have to know how to manage hundreds or thousands of people in confined spaces under conditions of extreme stress, with no clear timeline for when things might improve. The training programs for these personnel are extensive and ongoing. There are regular exercises in which the full continuity of government sequence is rehearsed. Officials practice the evacuation process. Communication systems are tested. The alternate command structures are activated on paper and in simulation. These exercises have formal names and classified schedules, and they have been conducted regularly since the 1950s. Some of them are quite large, involving multiple facilities simultaneously, testing not just the individual capabilities of each site, but the ability of those sites to communicate with each other and with military command authorities. During the Cold War, some of these exercises involved hundreds of officials and took place over multiple days. Personnel who have participated in them describe an experience that is simultaneously realistic in its details and surreal in its implications. You are sitting in an underground room, going through the procedures for managing the American government after a nuclear exchange, and the procedures work, and the communications function, and everything operates exactly as designed. And you understand, looking around that room, that the reason all of this exists is because someone in some office tower somewhere decided it needed to. Because the alternative was not having it, and not having it was simply not acceptable. There is another category of survivability infrastructure that most people never discuss when they talk about bunkers and doomsday facilities, and that category involves mobility. Because fixed facilities, no matter how well built, have a fundamental vulnerability. If the enemy knows where they are, and they have weapons accurate enough to destroy them, the entire investment is at risk. The solution to that problem was to put the most critical command functions on moving platforms. The most famous of these is the E-4B Nightwatch aircraft, more commonly known as the Airborne Command Post, or by its informal name, the Doomsday Plane. The E-4B is a heavily modified Boeing 747. There are 4 of them in the U.S. Air Force inventory. At least one of them is airborne or on alert at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The aircraft is a flying command center, capable of performing essentially every function of a ground-based command facility while traveling at 30,000 feet at roughly 600 miles per hour. It can refuel in flight, which means it can theoretically stay airborne for days at a time, limited not by its fuel supply but by the ability to keep its crew functioning. The aircraft carries its own communication systems, including extremely low-frequency radio equipment that can communicate with submarines even when they are submerged. It has its own hardening against electromagnetic pulse. It has battle staff areas, briefing areas, communications rooms, and a working space for the National Command Authority, the President and the Secretary of Defense, or their successors. The E-4B exists because the planners who designed the continuity of government system understood that a moving target at 30,000 feet is far harder to kill than a fixed facility in a mountain. Even the most accurate ballistic missile has to know where to aim. An aircraft that is constantly moving, that can change course, that gives no advance notice of its location, represents a genuinely survivable command platform in a way that no ground facility fully can. The crews who fly and maintain these aircraft train continuously. The systems are updated regularly. And the aircraft is considered one of the highest priority assets in the entire United States military inventory, not because of what it carries in terms of weapons, but because of what it represents in terms of authority. The Navy has its own version of this mobile command capability in the form of specially configured ships and submarines. The concept of the National Emergency Command Authority, the people who hold the legal authority to order and manage military responses, surviving at sea rather than in a fixed location, is deeply embedded in American nuclear strategy. Ballistic missile submarines are themselves a form of survivable command and response capability, spending months at sea, undetected, carrying weapons that could be launched in response to a first strike. But beyond the submarines, there are ships specifically configured for command functions, with the communication systems and battle management capabilities needed to coordinate a response. The entire American nuclear triad, the submarines, the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the bomber aircraft, was designed with survivability as a core principle. Not just the survivability of the weapons themselves, but the survivability of the command structure that would authorize their use. Because the deterrence value of nuclear weapons depends entirely on the adversary believing that if they strike first, they will face a response. If the command structure is so vulnerable that a sophisticated first strike could eliminate it, the deterrence calculation breaks down. The Soviets would know that a well-timed attack could eliminate not just cities, but the ability to respond, and that knowledge could make a first strike look attractive, rather than suicidal. The entire elaborate infrastructure of Raven Rock and Mount Weather and the E-4B aircraft and the continuity of government protocols exists, at its core, to make a first strike look genuinely suicidal to anyone contemplating it. It is deterrence through demonstrated survivability. We are telling you that you cannot kill us. Not our cities, not our government, not our command authority. We will survive and we will respond. That is the message. And the investment in communicating that message, in making it credible, in making it physically real rather than just claimed, runs into hundreds of billions of dollars over 7 decades. Now let us go deeper into what life inside one of these facilities would actually look like in an activated scenario, because the engineering is fascinating, but the human reality of what it would mean to actually be there, to be one of the people in the mountain when the bombs fall, is something that the technical discussions rarely capture. Imagine you receive the alert. You are a senior official, a military officer, a member of the congressional staff designated for evacuation. The procedures you have rehearsed dozens of times are suddenly real. There are specific transportation arrangements. There are specific routes. There are specific checkpoints and protocols. Everything is timed, because the window between warning and impact might be measured in minutes. Intercontinental ballistic missiles from Russian territory to the American mainland take approximately 30 minutes to arrive. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles from closer positions could provide as little as 15 minutes of warning. The evacuation procedures are designed to move priority personnel in those windows. If you are selected for evacuation, you are not taking your family. You are not calling your spouse. You are following the procedures, getting into whatever vehicle has been arranged, and moving. The moment you enter the facility and the blast doors close behind you, you are in a different world. The air you breathe is filtered. The water you drink comes from underground. The light around you comes from generators. The news from the outside world, if there is any, comes through hardened communication systems, and you are waiting. Waiting for the impact, waiting for the shockwave, waiting for the all-clear that may or may not come. For hours or days after the initial exchange, communication with the outside world would be deeply compromised. The electromagnetic pulse effects, the destruction of transmission towers, the death of the people who operated communications infrastructure, all of it would degrade the picture. The people inside the facility would be managing with incomplete information, trying to reconstruct what had happened, trying to assess the scale of destruction, trying to maintain contact with military commands and surviving regional governments. And they would be trying to do all of that while dealing with the psychological reality of what had just happened. The world they knew is gone. The cities where they grew up, where their families lived, may be gone. The entire familiar structure of American life has been shattered, and they have work to do. The psychological preparation for this scenario has been taken seriously by the planners, though it receives far less attention than the technical and physical preparations. Personnel assigned to continuity of government functions receive training that includes discussion of the stress and psychological trauma they might experience in an activated scenario. There are protocols for managing morale, for providing structure and routine, for giving people meaningful work to do in a situation where the meaninglessness of the destruction around them might otherwise be overwhelming. The physical design of the facilities also reflects some awareness of the human need for something beyond pure function. The Raven Rock complex, for example, has areas that are less purely utilitarian than you might expect, spaces designed to feel somewhat less like a bunker and somewhat more like a place where human beings can actually live and work over extended periods. The lighting is designed with human circadian rhythms in mind. There are spaces for physical activity, there are spaces for quiet, for what passes in an underground facility for privacy, because the planners understood that a government cannot function if the people running it collapse psychologically within the first week. One aspect of these facilities that is rarely discussed publicly is the question of who exactly is on the list. The continuity of government programs have always involved a carefully managed selection of who gets access to the facilities in an emergency. Not everyone can be saved. Not everyone can be accommodated. The facilities have finite capacity, and the decisions about who fills that capacity reflect a particular view of what is necessary to reconstitute a functioning government. The priority categories have always included the president and vice president and their immediate successors in the constitutional line of succession. They have included members of the cabinet. They have included members of Congress. They have included the senior military officers who hold operational command authority. They have included certain technical specialists whose knowledge is considered essential for recovery. Nuclear engineers who understand how to maintain weapons systems. communications specialists who can keep the systems running, medical personnel, power generation specialists, the people whose knowledge and authority are considered the minimum necessary to keep the government alive and functional. What this means in practice is that tens of millions of Americans who are not on any list would face a nuclear exchange without the protection that the people in those bunkers enjoy. That is not a secret. It has never been a secret. The planners who designed the system knew it. The officials who authorized the funding knew it. And the calculus, as cold as it sounds, was this. The facilities exist not to save individuals, but to save the institutional structure of the government. Not to protect these particular human beings, but to ensure that the presidency, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the military command, the constitutional framework that defines what America is, survives in some form. Whether that calculus is morally satisfying is a question that the people who designed the system thought about, argued about, and ultimately answered in the only way they could given the constraints they faced. Let us talk about some of the other facilities in the network that have been partially declassified or discussed in historical accounts, because the full scope of the system is larger than most people realize. High Point Special Facility is one of them. Located in the mountains of North Carolina, this facility served as the designated evacuation site for President Eisenhower and was used for planning and preparation throughout the early Cold War period. Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, has its own hardened communications facilities and emergency preparedness infrastructure. The Pentagon itself has substantial underground areas and survivability features, though its relative proximity to a major urban target has always made it less survivable than the more remote mountain facilities. The continuity of government infrastructure also extends to regional levels. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, manages a network of regional emergency operations centers distributed across the country. In an extreme scenario, these regional centers could function as nodes in a distributed government structure, maintaining local authority and coordination even if the central government were severely damaged. The concept of distributed government, of authority existing not just in one place but in many places simultaneously, reflects a sophisticated understanding of the failure modes of centralized systems. A government that depends entirely on Washington is a government that dies when Washington dies. A government designed to distribute its authority, to push decision-making and legal legitimacy down into multiple nodes, is far harder to kill with any number of weapons. The technology inside these facilities has evolved continuously since they were first built. The communication systems of the 1950s were based on radio and hardened telephone lines. By the 1970s and 1980s, satellite communications had been integrated, along with early computer systems. The digitization of government records and communications in the 1990s and 2000s created new challenges and new opportunities for continuity planning. Today, the cyber dimension of continuity of government is just as important as the physical dimension. A nuclear exchange would be accompanied by, and potentially preceded by, massive cyber attacks on American infrastructure, American financial systems, American communications networks, and American military command systems. The continuity of government infrastructure must be hardened, not just against physical destruction and electromagnetic pulse, but against sophisticated cyber attacks that could disable communications, corrupt data, or penetrate classified systems. The investment in cyber resilience for these facilities is enormous and almost entirely classified, but the general direction of the effort is not hard to deduce. You want systems that are isolated from the public internet, that operate on closed networks with multiple layers of authentication, that can function even when the normal digital infrastructure of American life has been destroyed. You want operators who have trained extensively on the systems and who can manage them manually if the automated systems fail. You want redundancy, multiple communication pathways, multiple power sources, multiple data backups, so that no single point of failure can silence the government. There is a story that circulates among people who study these facilities, and it illustrates something important about the psychology of continuity planning. In the darkest years of the Cold War, the years when Soviet nuclear capabilities were growing fastest, and American planners were most uncertain about how a nuclear exchange might actually unfold, there were officials whose job was quite specifically to think about the morning after, not the moment of impact. Not the exchange itself, but the next morning. What happens when the sun comes up the day after a nuclear war? Who is in charge? What resources exist? What does a government do first? The people who worked on those questions were among the most grimly serious individuals in Washington. They produced plans, detailed, specific, operational plans for managing a post-nuclear government, plans for communications priorities, for resource allocation, for the legal framework under which emergency authority would be exercised. Plans for what the surviving government would say to the American people if any significant number of them survived in condition to receive communications. Those plans exist. Many of them remain classified, but the existence of them tells you something important about how the American government has always approached this problem. Not with denial, not with the assumption that nuclear war is unthinkable and therefore needs no planning, but with the cold, hard, extraordinarily unpleasant acknowledgement that it might happen, that preparation matters, and that the job of government is to prepare for the worst even while doing everything possible to prevent it. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s did not end the continuity of government program. It modified it. Budgets were reduced. Some facilities were decommissioned or repurposed. The Greenbrier, as we discussed, was closed as an active emergency relocation site after its existence was revealed. Some of the smaller regional facilities were mothballed, but the core of the infrastructure remained intact. Raven Rock continued to be maintained and staffed. Mount Weather continued to operate. The E-4B aircraft continued to fly. The presidential succession protocols continued to be exercised. And after September 11, 2001, the program received renewed attention and significant new investment. The terrorist attacks of that day demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the threats to American government were not solely or even primarily nuclear. They could be asymmetric. They could be sudden, domestic, and unexpected. The continuity of government framework was expanded and updated to address a broader range of catastrophic scenarios. New classified directives established clearer lines of succession, clearer protocols for the devolution of authority, clearer procedures for the reconstitution of government functions from dispersed locations. The concept of continuity of operations, ensuring that essential government functions continue even when normal operations are disrupted, was extended beyond the most senior levels of the executive branch to encompass a much wider range of government agencies and functions. Every major federal agency now has its own continuity plan, its own emergency operating locations, its own procedures for maintaining essential functions during a catastrophe. The Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Energy, which manages the nuclear weapons stockpile, the intelligence community, the Federal Reserve. All of them have plans and facilities and designated personnel whose specific job is to make sure that if the worst happens, the institution survives and continues to function. The nuclear dimension remains the central organizing concern. However, even in the post-Cold War, post-September 11 world, the reason is simple. Nuclear weapons remain the only threat capable of destroying the United States as a functioning society in a single exchange. Everything else, terrorism, conventional war, cyber attacks, natural disasters, can cause tremendous damage. Nuclear war is in a category by itself. And the countries that possess nuclear weapons capable of threatening American territory, Russia first among them, remain formidable military powers with sophisticated delivery systems, sophisticated targeting plans, and sophisticated understanding of American vulnerabilities. Russia today operates its own continuity of government infrastructure, its own deep underground facilities, its own mobile command platforms, its own hardened communication systems. The Russian system is in many ways even more extensive than the American one, reflecting the Soviet tradition of investing heavily in passive defense alongside offensive capability. There are reports of enormous underground construction projects in Russia in recent decades, facilities significantly larger than anything in the American inventory, designed to shelter not just the government and military leadership but significant portions of the population. The existence of these facilities on both sides of the former Cold War divide reflects a world that has never fully escaped the logic of nuclear deterrence and never fully resolved the underlying tensions that make that deterrence necessary. What does it mean to know this exists? What does it mean to know that somewhere in the mountains of Pennsylvania, somewhere in the hills of Virginia, somewhere in the classified infrastructure of the American government, there are people at work right now whose job is to survive whatever is coming? It means that the people who built this country, who serve it, who work to maintain it, have always taken seriously their responsibility, not just to the present, but to the future. It means that even in the moments of greatest danger, the assumption embedded in American governance has always been that there must be something worth saving, something worth the enormous investment of time and money and human ingenuity required to build these places. The United States Constitution, the rule of law, The idea that a government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed and must answer to that consent, those ideas are what the bunkers are ultimately protecting. Not the people in them, not the specific officials who rotate through them, but the institutional framework that makes American government something more than the sum of its current office holders. The facilities exist because the alternative is a world where the destruction of one city can silence a government permanently. And that world, the world where governments can be erased by weapons, where institutional continuity can be broken in a moment, is far more dangerous than even the weapons themselves. These bunkers are, in the deepest sense, an act of institutional faith. A commitment made in concrete and steel and classified engineering that the American experiment will continue, that the Republic has value worth extraordinary measures to protect, and that whatever comes next, there will be someone with legitimate authority to face it and to lead whatever comes after. The men and women who staff these facilities, who maintain these systems, who train for scenarios they desperately hope will never be real, who carry the weight of this particular responsibility through careers that most Americans will never know existed, deserve recognition that they will rarely receive. They are not famous. They do not give interviews. They work in classified environments on classified problems, for which the best outcome is that their work is never needed. They are the keepers of the last resort, the people who wait, who prepare, who maintain, and who will be ready if the moment ever comes. That is a particular kind of service, not glamorous, not recognized, not celebrated at parades or acknowledged in speeches, but essential in the deepest sense of the word, the kind of essential that you only fully appreciate when you think clearly about what would happen without it. These mountains hold secrets that have kept this country sleeping soundly for 7 decades. And whether you knew it or not, every night you have spent in peace has been in some measure guaranteed by the people in the bunkers, the people in the aircraft, the people in the submarines, and the people who built the infrastructure of survival that most Americans will never see and may never fully appreciate. The hidden facilities are not just an engineering achievement. They are a statement about what we value, about what we refuse to let die, and about the lengths to which a free society will go to remain free, even in the face of the end of the world. If you learned something today that changed the way you look at those quiet mountains and ordinary hillsides, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. There is more to tell, and we are just getting started.